So welcome, everyone. Delighted to see all of you and many hundreds who are online tonight as well. This is the first of 3 of our HMSC Egyptology lectures this semester. So pull out your calendars. In addition to tonight's extravaganza, we have Julia Trochet from Missouri State University coming on October 11, and then Patrizia Piacentini all the way from Milan on November 2. So I hope we'll see you for those. Most likely back in the Geological Lecture Hall, but anything is possible. So great to see you. We're hoping that many of you who are not yet HMSC members will join. I don't think we have any brochures here at the moment, but you can just Google HMSC, Harvard Museums of Science and Culture, and you'll get all the information that you need to know and get all the updates on what's coming up in the way of programs and events. Tonight, Dr. Miroslav Bárta comes to us from Prague, where he's professor of Egyptology at the Charles University, Czech Republic, and director of the Czech Archaeological Mission. He also served as director of the Czech Institute of Egyptology and vice-rector of the Charles University. This institute has worked for decades at the incredibly important Old Kingdom site, and as we now know, also very important for later periods as well, the site of Abusir, home to many of the Fifth Dynasty's royal pyramids. He earned his PhD in Egyptology in 1997 in Prague and Hamburg, his habilitation in Egyptology in 2002, and he's been professor of Egyptology since 2009. His primary fields of research include the archaeology and history of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, landscape archaeology in antiquity, the rise and fall of complex societies, interdisciplinary research, and the archaeological background of the Old Testament. He's been excavating in Egypt since 1991, not just at Abusir, but also in the Western Desert from 2003 to 8, and since 2009 in Sudan as well. In 2002, he directed the first detailed satellite mapping of the pyramid fields of Abusir, Saqqara, and Dashur, unfortunately not including Giza, for which I will never forgive him. He was a guest professor in 2003 and 4, teaching at the University of Pennsylvania on a Fulbright scholarship, and in 2014 was at the American University in Cairo. In 2008, he was awarded an Alexander von Humboldt Prize at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and he serves on several editorial boards, PhD committees from America to Australia, and he's on the board of advisors to the Egyptian Ministry of Antiquities for the Scan Pyramids project, which you may recall, that was the one that discovered the so-called Big Void inside the Great Pyramid of Khufu. He's the author of the 7 Laws of Civilizations theory, which is also published recently, and his list of published books and articles extends out the door and around the block. So I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to list some names of some of the English language books, such as Civilizations, Collapse and Regeneration. This is from most recent to older. Analyzing Collapse, The Rise and Fall of the Old Kingdom. Satellite Atlas of the Pyramid Fields. Abusir and Saqqara, volumes covering the years 2000, 2005, 10, 15, and 20. Abusir, volume 23, The Tomb of the Sun Priest Nefer-Inpu. Journey to the West, The World of the Old Kingdom Tombs. Abusir 19, The Tomb of Hetepi. Swimmers in the Sand, on the Neolithic origins of ancient Egyptian mythology and symbolism. Abusir 13, The Cemeteries at Abusir South, Tomb Complex of the Vizier Kar and his family. Satellite Atlas of the Pyramids again in an earlier version. Sinui, The Bible and the Patriarchs, and Abusir 5, The Cemeteries of Abusir South, taking us all the way back to 2001. But it is my great delight to announce that tomorrow, Dr. Bárta will be introduced as a new international member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, just around the corner and off campus here. So congratulations on that. Very prestigious honor. We're very lucky, though, to have convinced him to arrive early before the ceremony here at Harvard, ahead of that august ritual, to speak to us on finding the god Osiris, the latest excavations at Abusir and Saqqara. And now I will stop talking, and please welcome Dr. Miroslav Bárta.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Peter, for a lovely introduction. And I'm afraid the only conclusion I can draw from it is that I'm getting really old. It's really my pleasure to see so many old young friends coming despite current circumstances. So I really appreciate it. Today I will talk about some, because Peter was quite strong and said 60 minutes, that's it. Some of our recent projects in the field in the transitional zone between Abusir and Saqqara. And, for obvious reasons, it's very difficult for me to say whether we are still in Abusir or whether we already entered Saqqara. I start with this because it's a typical artifact from the French cathedral in Reims, which shows wonderful windows, glass-stained windows by Marc Chagall. And obviously, one of the goals in archaeology is to get as perfect picture of the past as possible. But we never get there. We normally start with this. And the task of archaeology is to keep big pictures in mind, but at the same time collect as many small tiles as possible to get as close as possible to the famous windows of Marc Chagall. So that would be my basic comparison of archaeology to ours. Let's delve now into deep history of the 3rd millennium BC. What you see here is the pyramid field of Abusir, residential necropolis of the 5th Dynasty kings, and a view from one of the Abusir pyramids all over the plains in southeast direction. So tonight I will talk about this particular area, as I said, in the transitional zone between Abusir on the north and Saqqara proper on the south. This area was of particular importance during the 3rd, 4th, and 5th dynasties, as it was really close to the principal entrance into the cemetery. Nowadays, as you may remember, we enter the site from this spot close to the valley temple of Unas. However, in the 3rd millennium BC, it was the lake of Abusir that represented the principal access, and from there, crossing this semi-permanent body of water, you could decide whether you want to continue northwards to reach Abusir pyramids and tombs, or to continue southwards towards the pyramid complex of Djoser. And along this ancient wadi, many tombs of the Old Kingdom period were built. I will talk about 5th Dynasty in general. So this is as far as we can get the precise dates for individual kings of the 5th Dynasty, starting around 2465 BC and ending up 2323 BC. And some orientation points for earlier and later kings. So for instance, Djoser, 2670. Or Pepi II, which represents the end of the Old Kingdom, around 2170. We will stay in the 21st century, 25th century BC, and you might be interested having a look at other parts of the contemporary world then. So for instance, in the ancient Near East, first city empire, Lagash, existed. In Caral, Peru, was built the first stone city dating to about 26th, 25th centuries BC. In Britain, there came into being the first stage of the Stonehenge, and in North America, with all due respect, the Koshai culture. So this is basically comparison if you take Stonehenge, Caral, Lagash, or Cochise, and the pyramids. I said that we have to mind big picture, and there are big question marks in ancient Egyptian history. I call them punctuated leaps or punctuated equilibria. If you look at the chart, we have, for instance, end of the 2nd dynasty,
represented by Hasechemvi, father of Nesherichet. And if you compare their tombs, you can easily understand why I talk about leaps, because take the tomb of Hasechemvi and his son Djoser. There is no evolution. There is just a huge leap in complexity. And in a similar way, we have Snofru, and this is the topic for tonight, the Fifth Dynasty reign of Neuserra, as I will show you in a few moments. And then, obviously, end of the Sixth Dynasty, comparing typically pyramid of Pepi II and one of his successors, Ibi. So don't forget punctuated equilibria. Neuserra, all the tombs you will see later in this talk date more or less to his reign. Neuserra built for himself a mortuary complex in Abusir. During his time, we have many innovations like twin statues from his sun temple. We have a very complex structure in Abu Ghurab, sun temple of Neuserra. And it's precisely in his time that we have first appearance of monumental non-royal architecture as displayed by this example belonging to a famous hairdresser, royal hairdresser, who became vizier. Quite unusual career, but at the same time quite typical for this leap period. This is the only screen with some text. I apologize if it is boring for you, but it's important to me, so you have to cope with that. So this is a brief overview of major innovations dating or characterizing the reign of Neuserra, like status race on the part of the elite, building all of a sudden monumental tombs. We have what I would call limited democratization of the afterlife, connected with the introduction of the god of the afterlife, Osiris. Hereditary principle in administration, exponential growth of nepotism and lobbying, later on formulated by famous American economist Mancure Olson. We have development of new decoration schemes in non-royal tombs, and increasing number of wealthy tombs, etc. This is what I call evolutionary paradox, and I will talk basically about these two tombs. We have tomb of Ptahshepses. You remember the famous false door in the British Museum. It's Marriott tomb C1. And look at this. We are in the reign of Neuserra, and we have this small, narrow chapel. And at the same time, his contemporary, T, builds this. And they were on the par. He married a royal daughter of Hamad. He was almost a vizier, given by some his titles. And then we have, obviously, the famous Abusir vizier, Ptahshepses, who probably as the first one started to usurp some royal privileges incorporated in the architecture, like magazines, solar boats, open court, east-west oriented cult chapel, room with 3 niches, monumental portico, etc., etc. So this is what I call the status race. The high officials were bargaining with the king for power and influence. And also in this particular period, we have first proofs for the fact that sons and grandsons of these big officials were following in their offices. So that's why I'm saying hereditary principle in royal administration. And this is the big picture, and I will talk about how it displays in individual small case studies. Cemetery of Marriott, North Saqqara or South Abusir, depends on, I prefer South Abusir. Yes, I prefer South Abusir. So here you have the pyramids in Abusir on the north, Abusir South, Makramala Cemetery, dating to the reign of 10, and then what I call cemetery of T. And one obvious problem with Marriott is that he managed to excavate within a couple of months more than 120, 130 plus tombs.
And each tomb was published on like 2 or 3 pages. 1860s. In the meantime, most of the tombs were completely forgotten. We have no indications of their precise locations. Mariette never bothered to excavate them completely, etc. So we decided, this is the list of all the tombs. Early dynastic period 4, then from the early 4th dynasty 16 tombs, 27 dating to the middle 4th dynasty, 70 tombs from the 5th dynasty, 17 tombs from the 6th dynasty, and so on and so forth. So you can see that that was quite an intensive looting taking place in the 1860s. So we decided to have a look at some of those tombs because they have huge historical significance, and prior to our project we knew really very, very little. All of them are located along this ancient processional way, starting in the lake of Abusir and going up to the complex of Neuserra. So there is something very special about this area with the 4th, 5th dynasty tombs, Serapeum, and basically ancient Egyptians never stopped being active in this particular area for more than 3,000 years. We decided first to start with the tomb of T, which is very close to Serapeum, and then there are other tombs I will talk about, like Ptahshepses, Nimaatra, and then Ptahshepses buried in the tomb C1. And as you can see, when you use old maps, that's all you've got. Their location is quite imprecise. So that was one of the tasks in the field, to locate precisely individual tombs. That could be done only with the help of satellite images. As Peter noticed, we had 2 satellite images campaigns back in 2002 with really ancient Google images, QuickBird images, sorry. There was no Google at the time, I think. And then we commissioned a new set of images covering all pyramid fields in Egypt. That's the 2nd edition of the atlas that includes also Giza. Published just last year. So with a satellite image, we could locate most of these tombs under discussion. As I said, we started with the tomb of T. And what you see on the screen now is the complete publication of the mastaba by T. This is it. So compared, for instance, with the Giza mastaba series standard. And as wonderful publications, for instance. So this is it. Now you may understand why we decided to focus on T back in 2018. The tomb was discovered, obviously, by Mariette, but despite all efforts, never published properly. So we decided first to finish the excavation, because this whole part was never documented archaeologically. And you can see it's quite a substantial part of the mastaba, right? Imagine, we talk about the best preserved tomb in whole Saqqara necropolis. And at the same time, it's a tomb that's never been sufficiently explored archaeologically and never published properly. So we decided to clean all the decorated surfaces, install new electricity. Perhaps if you managed to be there in the last few years, you could notice the difference. Make a 3D scan of the whole structure, photograph it with Sandro Vanini, and now we have a big dilemma how to publish the tomb, because we have all the data, but we can't decide about the form that would be both fancy and usable. The mastaba poses some problems. First, let me mention that during the 2018 and 19 campaigns, we really came across 5 shafts. Shafts 3 and 5 probably belonging to other members of T that were probably buried in the complex. Is his eldest son, Demesh, whose false door is here,
a Nefertiti, his wife, T's wife, whose false door is in here. And then the two famous false doors belonging to T over here. And that's the first reference to Osiris in this talk, because as you can see on the false doors, the offering scenes of Nefertiti still features bread loaves, very tall ones, but still bread loaves. Whereby on the offering tables of T, we have already shape of the clear reed leaves. And as we know from the iconography, these reed leaves are indicative of the cult of Osiris. So that's one thing. Another thing, for which I have at the moment no explanation, is how these two false doors went about their own cults, because they are in a very narrow corridor. And if you imagine altars in the corridor, etc., it will be very difficult to get into the principal chapel over here. So anyway, leaving this problem aside, we were able to find probably burial chamber of Nefertiti over here, unfinished or very poorly executed, and burial chamber with a robbed sarcophagus, obviously in antiquity of damage. There's more evidence for this family above the entrance into the main chapel here, and it's his beloved son Ubenka here, then keeper of secrets T, Junior, then we have the known damage, and then fourth son, whose name is unfortunately not preserved. So let us go now to individual shafts. I will focus, I think, only on shafts 3 and 5. This is shaft 3, which was about almost 14 meters deep, completely looted. So it's still possible that Mariette probably excavated, but left no reference to it. Beautifully shaped limestone sarcophagus, but that was it, nothing else. Then, as I said, in shaft 5, at the bottom of shaft 5, that was even deeper, half a meter deeper, we found something that resembles an unfinished burial chamber, which probably belonged to the consort of the Nefertiti. We also managed to reopen and measure the two serdab. One serdab is at the entrance, in the entrance area over here. That's this one and this one. And then one of the biggest serdabs I've ever seen to the south of the chapel, which is the Roman number 6. And you can see really the dimensions only by looking at this boy helping us to clear the floor. Copy of the one of the statues found in it by Mariette. The original is nowadays in the Cairo Museum, or probably in the Grand Egyptian Museum. But according to Amelia Edwards, that traveled to Egypt in the 19th century, she heard, probably from Mariette or from somebody who worked with Mariette, that 20 statues were found in the serdab. We have no idea where they are. The only reference to them, I'm sorry, you can imagine what we lost. 19 statues of T and his family are missing. And what is also quite unusual about this mastaba is this band. You can see quite unusual, because T had to really made a huge compromise in order to set up the tomb right next to this processional way. And now I will tell you why. It's because of this mastaba going to Ptahshepses. Fortunately, Mariette missed it completely. So we had the privilege to excavate it for the first time in modern history. It's quite a substantial thing, almost 1,000 square meters. With late period structures on top of it. These structures were associated with pilgrims heading towards Serapeum, which is some 300-400 meters in southwest direction. And obviously we found many artifacts relating to the cult of Osiris during the late period. The mastaba features quite well preserved architecture, reaching a height of almost 5 meters. Very small, unfinished chapel with a pair of uninscribed limestone false doors. A serdab, the only place where we could establish the name of the tomb owner, Ptahshepses, the serdab being situated south of the chapel. And the burial chamber, again completely robbed, but in antiquity, judging by the fact that many original implements, artifacts were left in situ. Just few bones. On the left you can see the broken entrance into the burial chamber, sarcophagus here, and here general view of the chamber from the east, canopic jars, secondary steps leading to the top of the sarcophagus to facilitate the robbers plundering the mummy, and that was it. But still very important, because this mastaba precedes the tomb of T, and now we can understand why T had to make this famous bend, because Ptahshepses built a tomb there before him. And again, even Ptahshepses considered it important not to be buried close to his lord, but in this particular area, like T. Because normally you would expect these tombs close to the pyramids. In case of T, the pyramid of Neuserra. In case of Ptahshepses, probably somewhere in the northern part of Abusir necropolis. We also managed to find, because Ptahshepses in the early 5th Dynasty is not quite a common name, so we came across another Ptahshepses attested on the famous reliefs from the causeway of Sahura. He has the same title, Mejech Genuti, and is he participates in a festival together with the king. And I inclined to believe that Ptahshepses was one of the guys who was charged with decoration of the complex of Sahura. So that's why and it's quite a high position to take part in the banquet together with the king and his family. As I said, the tomb of Ptahshepses, I hope Salima is watching. The tomb of Ptahshepses also provide us with, as I said, with later period stuff. This small figure of Apis, and this lovely, unfortunately without any inscription, stela of Apis dating, say, to the 4th or 3rd centuries BC, and Salima during her visit. Then Mariette also published, that's the publication on the left, the tomb of Nimaatra. And this tomb is famous for the superstructure featuring several serdabs. And obviously we were quite curious whether this is really true, and we wanted to establish also the location of the tomb. And since it apparently belonged to the cemetery of T, we wanted to make sure that the location is correct. So this is beginning of the season after a couple of weeks of excavation. As you can see, everywhere you have wind-blown sand reaching a height of 5 to 7 meters. So it was quite a long season, a lot of money just to free the eastern portion of the mastaba and find entrance into the burial chamber. So this is, I want you to notice the plan properly. This is what you get from Mariette, right? Nothing else. You have no understanding how big, how well preserved or badly preserved the tomb was. And this is what you get when you excavate it. This is architecture 4,500 years old, completely preserved, featuring a cult niche over here, again, unfortunately without inscriptions, serdab with graffiti attesting to the fact that Nimaatra was owner of the mastaba, a long corridor with serdabs along the eastern facade, and here you have individual chapels. There was always a small chapel linked with the serdab. This is a general plan of the mastaba. Serdabs, chapels, principal entrance from the east. Cult chapel here, serdab. This part still remains to be excavated. And in the corridor, we had an entrance, a descending corridor into an anteroom and into the burial chamber, which you can see over here. This is entrance from the north. Again, completely looted. Some parts of the burial equipment were found in situ around the sarcophagus. Mummy completely missing, but the sarcophagus itself is really a nice specimen made of red granite, S1 material. So we were quite successful. And then my biggest dream since 10, 12 years was Ptahshepses C1, who is famous for the British Museum false door and lintel from the entrance. But that was a more tricky thing because this is what you get when you walk over there. It's just one hillock next to another. We knew again from the publication of Marriott that the tomb looked like this. So this is first hint that you can use when working with the satellite image. And then we also had tentative dimensions of the mastaba. So we basically produced a rectangular and we're looking in the field if this is really the tomb. As I said, since 1860s, this guy, the first non-royal official who got the privilege to marry a royal daughter of Uzerka of Hamad, the guy who was raised in the court of Menkaura and passed away during the reign of Neuserra. So many Egyptologists doubted his age because it's made it impossible to have a person, living from Menkaura down to Neuserra. We also knew from his false door that he was one of the first guys who introduced Osiris into ancient Egyptian religion, which was a huge break because all of a sudden you got the god who was responsible for the afterlife. And what matters even more, and forget the textbooks, it's a non-royal context. It's not a royal context. Osiris first comes up in non-royal context. Don't ask me why, because I've got my 60 minutes. So this was really a challenge. The false door, I mentioned the lintel from the entrance. I mentioned the god Osiris, who is over here. And last year, in October, we did succeed to locate the mastaba. This is a view of the tomb after the first season excavation. We actually needed 2 seasons, fall 2022 and spring season 2023, in order to get all these data. So this is eastern facade of the mastaba, ground plan, entrance from the north, from the lake of Abusir. You have one area here with a false door, one area here with two niches, probably corresponding with these 2 shafts, with no burials at the bottom, maybe unfinished. Then descending corridor leading into a burial chamber, to which I will get later. And the chapel itself is a serdab here, and an open court with another serdab over here. So you can compare what I just showed you with this sophisticated plan provided by Marriott. During the course of excavation, we managed to clean and partially restore the chapel, which you can see here. And again, I showed you at the beginning these mastabas, Teshpes C1 and T. They were roughly contemporary. Don't forget it. And you see the profound difference. They were more or less equal in status. But we have no explanation why this sudden leap happened and how it happened. The British Museum false door was originally here. The workers did some lousy work because they forgot some fragments in situ. This is the only one in situ, actually. Some others were found in the fill. And also the entrance was decorated. It featured painted decoration. In the fill of the chapel, we also came across this particular fragment, still displaying some original colors, most likely belonging to the daughter of Uzerkaf Hamad, the spouse of this Saqqara C1 Ptahshepses. This is the decoration. I use reconstruction, which is more instructive compared to photographs. So this is the north wall in the entrance, where you can see offering bearers bringing cattle here in detail. And here on the south wall, again, offering bearers and butchering scenes. So nothing really spectacular, but at least we can say the famous Ptahshepses with the story in the British Museum false door. Member of the royal family of Uzerkaf has such decoration, because without the excavation we would completely misunderstand Ptahshepses. So this is the false door, and during our work we came across some more fragments that originate from the false door. So now it's possible to have a full reconstruction of this historically unique document. And now, since we are in modern times, in the next picture I'm going to show you a mummy. So if you don't want to see the mummy, close your eyes, and I tell you when you can open them again, because I don't want to cause any kind of discomfort, okay? So, can we proceed? Okay. So this is it. That's the burial chamber. Limestone sarcophagus, entrance into the burial chamber with this beautifully carved corner with a blocking stone still in situ. We were unable to move it, so we had to dig under the portcullis. What you see here is, to my knowledge at least, and please tell me after the lecture if you know about similar examples, one of the earliest specimens of a mummified fish as a part of the burial equipment, and completely preserved, though robbed in antiquity, obviously, mummy of Ptahshepses. And thanks to our anthropologists, we know already that this guy passed away at the age of around 70 years. So we can now match the historical information from the false door kept in the British Museum, and with some real evidence we have from our field project. North of the mastaba, and we still keep some hopes, we came across this small chapel belonging to another Ptahshepses. So we think that he was son of Ptahshepses. Burial chamber, here you can see the lip of the shaft completely destroyed. And to the north of it is also published by Marriott, tomb of Lady Inti. And in the fill here, we came across this statue belonging to Sabu, who was owner of mastaba built north of Ptahshepses. So all this shows you how rewarding it can be to go back in the footsteps of Ptahshepses and to re-excavate, because Marriott really missed a lot of stuff. And in order to make some serious advances in modern Egyptology, you can not only excavate new mastabas, new archaeological entities, but we need even more to understand most of the tombs excavated in the 19th century. We need to spend more time determining their
precise locations and basically re-excavating them. If you are patient enough, it pays off. It really pays off. So the situation now is that we can say that we finished the excavation of T, which is almost a miracle after 160 years. We have a new tomb of Ptahshepses over here. We have Mastaba C1, which is roughly in this location. We have also tombs of Pehenuika C70, probably somewhere there. And that's a really tricky thing. It's almost impossible to establish precise location of this particular mastaba. And the tomb of Kai, that is probably here. All these people are dated more or less to the reign of Neuserra. And as I said at the beginning, we have these case studies, these micro probes into deep history of ancient Egyptian empire of the Old Kingdom. But at the same time, we have to understand that there is a big picture of huge changes. During the reign of Neuserra, Egypt reached an apogee in the development. But at the same time, the first indicators of approaching collapse, or if you want, loss of complexity, was drawing near and manifested itself in many spheres of everyday life. We have diminishing Nile floods, we have climate change, we have first attestations of lobbyism and nepotism, we have, we have evidence that many offices in the state, even in the highest echelons of the state, were becoming hereditary. So certain families were deciding about who is going to take this or that job. We have soaring mandatory expenses because there were becoming more and more officials, including the state administration, which is nicely reflected by the evidence, for instance, in the Abusir papyri. We have indications for cracking social contract, weakening role of the state, a crisis of legitimacy and participation. These are factors that we know from earlier publications. Status race. High officials were usurping more and more originally exclusive manifestations of the royal of the king. So the king had to come up with new specific manifestations of his extraordinary status, like a couple of years later during the reign of Unas. We have attestation for the text of the pyramids. Many innovations in religion, architecture, iconography of the tombs, because Ptahshepses C1 had a very limited decoration. And then imagine that you are almost vizier, and then somebody like T or Ptahshepses comes and says, I want it completely differently. So just the challenge for the artist, you know. Imagine if you decorate a small chapel, no problem, that was a century-long tradition. And he comes and says, look, I don't need, 20, 30 square meters of decoration. I want 1,500 square meters of decoration. I want this and that. All new motives. So that's why I think it's correct to talk about a leap year, a puncture. A real puncture, like for instance, between the Second and Third Dynasty, or the reign of Snofru, or the end of the Fourth, or the end of the Old Kingdom. And in order to detail this big picture, you must go to individual case studies, to individual projects in the field. And here you can see how the macro trends can be easily linked with case studies and micro evidence coming out from the field. And that's why I think that archaeology in Egyptology still matters, that it can show quite often surprising aspects of the society. And basically that the real key in understanding ancient Egyptian society
and the dynamics of the state over the centuries, from the beginning of the Third Dynasty down to the collapse by the end of the Sixth Dynasty, is just the archaeology. Because you can see there is so much evidence that was not available before, that this is the way how we should probably, I strongly believe, proceed in the future. So 45 minutes, I was good, right? So this is basically how I see archaeology. You never get a complete picture. You never get quite happy. You never get that famous Chagall window. By the way, Chagall was cousin of Serge Pozener, if you don't know it. So we have, again, a link with Egyptology. But our goal is twofold. To have in mind the big picture, and at the same time be patient enough to have, to be lucky, to have time, to have means to search for individual tiles and to put them back into the window. So that's how you can make a progress, not only in Egyptian archaeology, but in Egyptology and in science in general. Thank you very much.